The harvest moon hung heavy over the Maine coast, a swollen, crimson orb that seemed to pulse with malice, casting an unearthly glow across the jagged cliffs and churning waves below. Caleb Morrow's SUV jolted along a forsaken road, its tires crunching over gravel strewn with seaweed and broken shells, the remnants of storms that had battered this desolate stretch for centuries. Caleb, the enigmatic voice behind The Hour of Shadows, a creepypasta podcast that burrowed into the nightmares of millions, was a man haunted by more than his tales. Born in the forgotten fishing hamlet of Cutler's Cove, where the sea was both lifeblood and executioner, he'd grown up on stories of shipwrecks and specters, told by weathered fishermen in the glow of kerosene lanterns. His gravelly voice, honed by years of mimicking those salty raconteurs, spun tales of wraiths stalking fog-draped forests and horrors slithering from the ocean's depths. But fame had come at a cost. Caleb had left his family behind, his mother's tearful pleas, his father's silent resentment, for a microphone and a spotlight. Now, with The Hour of Shadows teetering on a plateau, his listeners, ravenous as the tide, demanded something raw, something that bled truth. Blackrock Point Lighthouse, a decaying monument to tragedy, was his answer, a live episode to either crown his legacy or drag him into the darkness he'd so long exploited. Blackrock Point loomed on a barren spit of land, a jagged finger of rock thrust defiantly into the Atlantic, where waves crashed with a fury that seemed personal. The lighthouse itself was a gaunt sentinel, its brick tower pitted by salt and time, streaked with black lichen that resembled tear tracks. Its lantern room, shattered decades ago, gaped like a wound, the broken glass glinting like teeth under the moon's accusing light. Built in 1857 to guide ships through the treacherous, fog-choked waters of the Devil's Cauldron, a stretch of reef-ridden sea that had claimed countless vessels, it had stood as a beacon of hope until 1923. That year, a storm of biblical wrath swept through, claiming the keeper, Amos Blackwood, his wife, Eliza, and their 2 children, Hannah and Samuel. Locals in Cutler's Cove, their voices hushed like mourners at a wake, spoke of Amos's descent into madness. Months of isolation, the relentless crash of waves, and the fog's suffocating embrace had broken him. Some said he heard voices in the sea's roar, urging him to carve his family's throats with a whaling knife before leaping from the tower, his body pulped on the rocks below, his blood mingling with the foam. Others whispered of darker forces. Micmac elders, whose ancestors had fished these waters long before the lighthouse's cornerstone was laid, spoke of the Wendigo of the waves, a demonic entity older than the cliffs, born from a forgotten pact with the sea's deepest shadows. It fed on despair, they said, twisting the minds of the lonely until they became vessels for its hunger, possessing any who lingered too long on its cursed ground. Others whispered of darker forces. Micmac elders, whose ancestors had fished these waters long before the lighthouse's cornerstone was laid, spoke of the Wendigo of the waves, a demonic entity older than the cliffs, born from a forgotten pact with the sea's deepest shadows. It fed on despair, they said, twisting the minds of the lonely until they became vessels for its hunger, possessing any who lingered too long on its cursed ground. Maritime logs from the 19th century, moldering in the Cutler's Cove Library, recorded strange incidents. Keepers reporting footsteps on the stairs at midnight, lanterns extinguishing themselves, and sightings of a skeletal figure with antler-like protrusions watching from the rocks. Caleb, ever the skeptic, with a performer's flair for theatrical dread, dismissed these as folklore ripe for his podcast. A backdoor deal with a historical society contact, a nervous archivist named Margaret, who clutched a rosary when she spoke of the place, granted him access, cloaked in promises of respect he had no intention of fully honoring. His guest was Dr. Nora Kline, a parapsychologist whose sharp intellect was a fortress against the supernatural, though cracks in that fortress betrayed a private terror of the unseen. In her mid-40s, with eyes like storm clouds over the Atlantic and a voice that cut through pretense like a scalpel, Nora had built a career debunking hauntings, her lectures at Boston University laced with dry wit and scientific rigor. Yet her own past whispered of an encounter she couldn't explain. A childhood memory of a shadow in her grandmother's attic, its eyes like burning coals, muttering her name in a tongue she didn't understand. That memory drove her to study the paranormal, not to believe, but to conquer her fear through reason. She'd sparred with Caleb on the Hour of Shadows before, dissecting the psychology of fear while secretly dreading the day her skepticism might fail her. When Caleb pitched the Blackrock episode, her pulse quickened, not just from the thrill of investigation, but from a gut-deep dread she couldn't name. She joined him, half drawn by curiosity, half by a compulsion to face the darkness head-on. Her canvas bag heavy with an EMF meter, a spirit box modified to scan radio frequencies for spectral voices, and a digital recorder sensitive enough to capture the faintest murmur. As they arrived at dusk, the October wind keened like a chorus of the lost, carrying the tang of salt and something fouler, like rotting kelp left to fester. The lighthouse stood stark against the roiling Atlantic, its keeper's cottage a squat, crumbling structure choked with thorny brambles that seemed to writhe in the fading light, their tips glistening as if dipped in blood. The air reeked of mildew and a cloying decay, like meat left too long in the damp. The ocean's roar was no mere sound, but a relentless, ravenous prayer, each wave a syllable in a hymn to something ancient and unforgiving. Inside, the keeper's cottage was a tomb of neglect, its air thick with the musty reek of abandonment and something fouler, like the sweet rot of a drowned thing washed ashore. Dust lay heavy on furniture frozen in time. A sagging armchair with faded floral upholstery, its springs rusted and poking through like bones. A wooden table scarred with knife marks, as if someone had carved their despair into its grain. And shelves lined with logbooks, their pages crumbling like forbidden texts, yellowed and curling as if shying from the light. The walls, once whitewashed, were now a sickly gray, etched with scratches that formed jagged patterns, runes perhaps, or the frantic clawing of a mind unhinged. Under Caleb's flashlight, these markings seemed to flicker, not merely reflecting light, but muttering secrets in a language older than the stones. The beam trembled in his hand, betraying a flicker of unease he'd never admit. His showman's bravado, a thin mask over the boy from Cutler's Cove who'd once feared the dark. Caleb set up his gear with practiced efficiency, though his fingers fumbled more than usual, the cottage's oppressive weight pressing against his confidence. He arranged microphones on the scarred table, their stands glinting like sentinels in the gloom, and positioned his laptop to stream the live episode of the Hour of Shadows. A portable generator hummed outside, its growl a frail defiance against the lighthouse's history of devouring power. He strung fairy lights along the walls, their frail amber glow casting shadows that danced like specters, barely holding the encroaching darkness at bay. Each bulb flickered erratically, as if the cottage resented their intrusion. Caleb's producer's mind noted the effect, perfect for ambiance, but a deeper instinct, born of childhood nights listening to the sea's warnings, prickled at his neck. He ignored it, focusing on the setup, but the air seemed to thicken with every wire he connected, as if the cottage itself were exhaling a warning. Nora, meanwhile, ascended the tower's spiral staircase, each iron step groaning like a plea for silence, the sound echoing up the narrow shaft like a cry trapped in a throat. The staircase, rusted and slick with damp, spiraled into a darkness so dense it seemed to swallow her flashlight's beam. Her breath clouded in the unnatural chill, each puff a ghostly wisp that lingered too long, as if the air were reluctant to let her go. Nora clutched her equipment bag, containing an EMF meter, a spirit box modified to catch spectral murmurs, and a digital recorder sensitive to the faintest sounds, her knuckles white, not from cold, but from a memory she'd buried, that attic shadow from her childhood, its coal-red eyes still haunting her dreams. She'd come to Blackrock Point to prove her skepticism, to cage her fear in data, but each creak of the stairs felt like a heartbeat, pulsing with the lighthouse's cursed history. She paused halfway, her scientific resolve wavering, as she glimpsed, through a cracked window, the Atlantic's waves crashing against the rocks below, their foam glinting like bared teeth under the moon. As night swallowed the world, the cottage's candles became their only light, their flames trembling as if aware of the darkness pressing in. The generator, despite its recent servicing, sputtered ominously, and the fairy lights dimmed, casting the room in a flickering half-light that made the scratched runes seem to writhe. The air grew heavy with the weight of forgotten lives, Amos Blackwood's despair, his family's terror, the countless sailors whose ships had splintered on the reefs. Caleb, seated at the table, adjusted his headset and leaned into the microphone, his voice rich and deliberate, a velvet blade cutting through the silence. Welcome, Shadow Seekers, to the Hour of Shadows, live from Blackrock Point Lighthouse, where the sea chants of the damned and the darkness breathes. His words were a performer's spell, conjuring the gothic menace he'd mastered, but beneath them lay a tremor of doubt, a Cutler's Cove boy sensing the sea's hunger. The first hour sparked with electric energy, the live stream crackling with the fervor of thousands tuning in. Caleb spun the lighthouse's grim history into tales of creeping horror, his voice weaving the 1923 storm, Amos Blackwood's madness, and the Mi'kmaq legend of the Wendigo of the waves with ornate menace. He described Amos's final log entries, found decades later, scrawled in a trembling hand. Warnings of a shadow in the fog that sang his name, urging blood. He recounted the Mi'kmaq tales, passed down through generations, of a demonic entity born from a shaman's forbidden pact with the sea's depths, its antlered silhouette seen by sailors before their ships vanished. The podcast's chat exploded with comments, fans thrilled, skeptics scoffing, all feeding Caleb's ego. Nora, seated across from him, monitored her devices, their faint buzz a lifeline to her rationality. The EMF meter registered minor spikes, like the pulse of a sleeping beast, nothing alarming enough to breach her scientific shield. Yet her fingers lingered on the spirit box, her mind flashing to that childhood shadow, its muttered words echoing in her bones. As midnight struck, the air thickened, pressing against their lungs like a hand on the throat. The candles flickered in unison, their flames bending as if bowing to an unseen presence. A scratching began in the walls, rhythmic and deliberate, not the skitter of rats, but the calculated clawing of something trapped within, seeking release. Caleb, forcing a wry grin to mask the chill crawling up his spine, joked about vermin, but his voice cracked, betraying the fear he'd buried since leaving Cutler's Cove. Nora's spirit box, untouched, erupted in static, spitting broken syllables in a voice neither human nor machine. "Flee! It hungers!" Her hand froze, her skepticism crumbling as the words echoed her childhood terror. The live stream's chat surged with panic. "Did you hear that? Is this real?" But Caleb and Nora were beyond the digital chasm now, trapped in a reality that was unraveling. The terror surged, a relentless wave of horror that seemed to rise from the lighthouse's very stones. Shadows slithered from the corners, not cast by candlelight, but liquid and alive, pooling like oil before shaping into humanoid figures with hollow eyes. They muttered Caleb's childhood nickname, Cow, a secret buried with his mother, who died cursing his ambition, in voices like drowning sailors, their words gurgling as if pulled from waterlogged lungs. Frost crawled across the windows, not in delicate patterns, but in jagged symbols that pulsed with infernal intent. Ancient and unholy, like sigils from a grimoire penned in blood. Nora's EMF meter screamed, its needle pinned at maximum, the device vibrating as if trying to flee. Her recorder captured voices in guttural Latin, ego phalum tuum, I am your ruin, each syllable laced with a malice that seemed to claw at their minds. The room became a crucible, reality fraying like worn fabric, revealing something vast and ravenous peering through the emptiness, its hunger a tangible weight that pressed against their souls. Then the possession struck, demonic and unstoppable, a surge of infernal fury that seemed to erupt from the lighthouse's very foundations, as if the cursed ground beneath Blackrock Point had finally cracked open to release its long-imprisoned wrath. Nora, who had been mid-sentence analyzing the EVP recordings with her characteristic clinical detachment, froze abruptly, her body stiffening like a marionette caught in mid-motion. Her eyes rolled back in their sockets, revealing not the whites, but black hollows, endless chasms that swallowed the candlelight, reflecting nothing but an abyssal hunger. Veins twisted like gnarled roots beneath her pale skin, bulging and pulsing with an unnatural rhythm, as if something ancient and parasitic had slithered into her bloodstream. Her voice, once sharp and measured, warped into a guttural chorus, a layering of tones that echoed from her throat like a legion of damned souls speaking as one. She spat curses in a tongue older than Scripture, Aramaic syllables twisted into invocations of Asmodeus, a destroyer from the pit whose name evoked biblical plagues and the rending of flesh. The words hung in the air, heavy and oily, carrying the stench of sulfur and salt water, as if dredged from the ocean's deepest trenches. In that moment, the Wendigo of the waves revealed its insidious nature through her, a demonic force, not merely a spirit, but a primordial entity woven into the fabric of the sea's rage. Mi'kmaq legends, as Caleb had researched for his podcast, described it as a guardian twisted by betrayal, a spirit once protective of the coastal tribes, corrupted when European settlers desecrated sacred burial sites along the Devil's Cauldron reefs in the 1700s. It fed on isolation and regret, manifesting in possessions that amplified the victim's deepest guilts, turning their bodies into vessels for its vengeance. Nora, possessed now, lunged at Caleb with a feral grace that belied her scholarly frame, her nails elongating into jagged claws that gleamed like obsidian shards. She slashed his arm in a swift arc, drawing a line of fire across his flesh. His blood welled up and dripped to the floor, where it hissed and bubbled like acid on stone, stinking of brine and rot, the unmistakable reek of decayed seaweed and bloated flesh pulled from the tide. "The Wendigo of the waves tastes your sins, storyteller," she growled, her breath a fog of decay that clouded Caleb's vision, carrying the chill of underwater graves. "Your tales summoned it." Her words pierced him, not just as a threat, but as an accusation, dredging up the psychological torment the entity thrived on. Caleb's abandonment of his family in Cutler's Cove, his mother's dying pleas ignored for podcast episodes, his spinning of half-truths into true horror for clicks and downloads, his mind flooded with guilt, visions flashing like lightning, his father's disappointed stare, his sister's unanswered letters, laid bare by the entity's gaze, as if it peeled back his soul layer by layer. Caleb reeled, his heart pounding like a trapped animal against his ribs, but the entity's assault was far from over. The generator, that fragile link to the modern world, choked and sputtered with a final dying gasp, its hum fading into silence as if strangled by invisible hands. The fairy lights winked out one by one, plunging the cottage into flickering chaos. The candle's flames now the only barrier against total darkness, their light twisting shadows into grotesque shapes. Objects rose around them in a poltergeist frenzy, chairs scraping across the floor before lifting into the air, logbooks fluttering open to reveal pages scrawled with Amos Blackwood's mad ramblings, microphones hurtling like spears, all hurled by an unseen rage that seemed to pulse from the walls themselves. This poltergeist activity, Caleb realized in a haze of terror, was no random outburst, but a deliberate echo of the 1923 storm. Survivors' accounts from Cutler's Cove archives described similar upheavals in the lighthouse during Amos's final days. Furniture smashing against walls as if the Wendigo tested its hold before claiming its victims. Caleb's mind was breached next, a cold, oily presence oozing into his thoughts like ink in water, unearthing visions that blurred the line between hallucination and reality. The Blackwood family materialized before him, their forms rising from the floorboards as bloated corpses, skin pallid and slick with seawater, throats gaping and ragged smiles that oozed black ichor. Their eyes burned with hellfire, twin embers of accusation. And little Hannah, Amos's daughter, no more than 8 in the old photographs, shambled forward, her tiny fingers lengthening into hooks that sank into Caleb's leg, piercing denim and flesh with a searing pain. She murmured, "Stay forever," her voice a childish lilt warped by the entity's malice, pulling at his soul as if to anchor him to the curse. The haunting here was psychological warfare, the Wendigo forcing Caleb to relive not just the Blackwood's deaths, but his own moral failings, amplifying his isolation until despair made him ripe for possession. The horror crested in the tower, an invisible force, cold as the Atlantic's depths and strong as a riptide, seizing them both and dragging them up the spiral stairs. Each step was a descent into damnation, the iron groaning under their weight, the air growing thicker with the metallic tang of blood and the roar of winds that shouldn't exist indoors. Nora's possessed body convulsed beside him, limbs jerking in unnatural angles, her bones grinding audibly as the entity toyed with her form. The lantern room at the top was a maelstrom of chaos. Winds howled within the confined space, whipping debris, shards of glass, rusted metal fragments, torn pages from logbooks, into a spinning cyclone that tore at their clothes and skin. The entity emerged fully then, no longer content to lurk in shadows or vessels, manifesting as a towering shadow with antlers of jagged bone, branching like coral from a drowned reef, its eyes like molten coals that seared the air. Its form shifted fluidly, a visceral nightmare drawn from the Micmac tales. One moment, a skeletal mariner clad in tattered oilskins, barnacles crusting its bones. The next, a writhing mass of tentacles pulled from the ocean's abyss, slick and pulsating with veins of bioluminescent slime. This was the Wendigo of the waves in its truest guise. A demon that embodied the sea's dual nature, guardian and devourer. Its possessions a ritual to claim new souls, as it had with Amos and countless sailors lost to the reefs. It seized Caleb, an icy grip forcing his own hands to his throat, fingers tightening in a suicide vice that squeezed the breath from him, while Nora's body, still a puppet of the demon, levitated and slammed against the walls with bone-cracking thuds, each impact echoing like thunder, her screams mingling with the wind's howl. In a frantic act, born of desperation and the fragments of lore he'd gathered for the Hour of Shadows, Caleb shattered Nora's spirit box against the floor, the device exploding in a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated the entity's grotesque form. Choking out a half-remembered prayer from a creepypasta he'd once narrated, a banishing rite pieced together from Micmac chants and medieval exorcisms, invoking the sea's protective spirits to reclaim their corrupted kin. He felt the words burn his tongue like salt on a wound. It was a desperate gambit against the dark, A storyteller's last tale spun in defiance. The entity roared in response, a sound that cracked the remaining glass panes and tore at their sanity, a primal bellow that vibrated through their bones like the crash of a tidal wave. Then, as suddenly as it had risen, it fled into the fog rolling in from the sea, its form dissolving into wisps of shadow that slithered out through the shattered lantern. Dawn found them stumbling out of the lighthouse, broken and forever scarred. Nora catatonic, her eyes vacant as she muttered prophecies of ruin in fragmented Aramaic, her mind fractured by the possession's aftershocks. Caleb's voice now laced with an echo not his own, a subtle undertone of the entity's growl that warped his recordings into something otherworldly. The live stream, dubbed the Blackrock possession tape, spread like wildfire across the internet, listeners debating its authenticity in forums and chats, some claiming it was a hoax, while others reported nightmares after watching. But Caleb knew the truth. The Wendigo of the waves lingered, its hunger a persistent shadow in his soul, murmuring for his return, a curse that no dawn could fully dispel.